of Practice, Medio IGC 202, Unit 3. I'm Dr. Isabel Souza, your presenter for the series, and let's move on to the interpreter's primary task. So we've talked a lot about all our different responsibilities, but in order to do our primary task, which is mediating communication and interpretation between languages, we need to transform the messages that we're listening to in the source language in order to be able to express them in the target language. What I mean by that is that a lot of people think that we're just repeating what is being stated, that we're just interpreting words, we're just converting words from one language to the other. And the reality is it's so much of communication is not word for word. If we did interpret word for word, it wouldn't make any sense in the other language. Unless it's, two words like open door, maybe. But we really have to, internalize the message, pay real close attention to what it means, and then recreate it. That's why transform it into the target language so that it has the same exact effect as it would if it had been stated in its original form in the source language. So in order to do this, interpreters need fluency. There's an incredible need of fluency because you cannot rephrase something if you don't have good vocabulary and in order to do that, because there's many ways to state the same thing. However, you want to find the way that is closest to the meaning, to the intent of the message. And in order to have that, you need to have the language to be able to say something in many different ways. So that's usually the primary problem of some individuals who, think, oh, I'll help my mother, or I'll help my friend interpret, and not realizing that they might not even have the fluency to do that. There's an interpreter's need of knowledge. I mean, you're learning a lot here about healthcare, about how the system works, about our different roles. If you don't have that knowledge, you're not able to really behave in a way that acknowledges that. Interpreters also need to engage both parties. And as we are working to maintain equal distance from both parties, we also engage them. We can't only engage one party and not the other. So we have to be very careful for any situation where, because maybe we're having to ask for more clarifications of the patient, for example, that may require more side conversations with the patient. So we have to be very mindful and engage the other party and let them know every single time, excuse me, but the interpreter will have to engage in a discussion to find out what the patient said. And then, you get that approval from the other party, and then you go and you have that discussion. But you can't just be engaging one side without realizing that the other side will feel left out. So interpreters need to really work on that issue. We're like diplomats that are trying to not take sides and trying to be neutral and impartial as much as possible. We also work to establish that therapeutic rapport. And we can't do our job well if we're not always thinking of the provider and patient relationship, because communication is how we manifest the relationship. So the relationship is key. And if we think always that way, we're always going to put them first, and the outcome will be better. Let's move on here to interpreting tasks. Well, we set the stage. When do we set the stage? Well, when we do our introductions. Without that, we don't have a ground to stand on. It's very hard if we don't set the stage, even if very quickly in the beginning, that later we have to explain what we're doing. Because later means they didn't know. So we want all parties to know everything before we start interpreting. Then obviously the task of interpreting, which is where we are most of the time, A task of addressing barriers to communication only as needed, managing the flow of communication with our interventions, engaging both parties, ensuring turn taking is taking place, nobody's speaking on top of anybody. That's managing the flow. Managing the flow is not remaining outside the flow. A lot of times what happens, an interpreter will just pretend there's no flow issues and won't say a word, only interpret. And that's not managing the flow. That's just letting the flow go. So hopefully we don't need to intervene much, but if we do, we need to be able to do it in a very polite and professional way. Addressing intercultural issues, again, when necessary. And there will be times, I even have to say this, where there may be a cultural issue, but if the medical issue at hand is more important and they're getting somewhere and it's not something that needs to be addressed at that moment, you might even address it later in the post session. So not everything needs to be addressed during the session. Setting the stage is addressed before we start interpreting. And likewise, there are things we can do after we finish interpreting as well. Managing the triadic relationships, we've talked about that in the last unit and how important it is to, know at least on our part where we're coming from and what stance we have in that particular session. And then assisting in closure activities as needed. So those are some of our tasks. But the reality is that, interpreting is the one that takes the most of our time and is our, our go back to, because after doing all these other tasks, we end up going back to interpreting. So let's go on to the next slide. Being a cultural interface. This is a term that's used in the IMIA standard of practice, and they don't use the word mediation, they use interface, because that is what we are. And as stated before, meaning must be conveyed within the cultural context. Assumptions may need to be identified, but they certainly can't be made. Even if we're almost sure, we should always confirm it. That's also a sense of politeness and addressing the patient and the provider's agency. And then, they may or may not be articulated by the interpreter. Hopefully, one of the parties will articulate it themselves. Working with the provider to find ways to interpret untranslatable concepts. So there will be situations where you hear something and you're trying to figure out, how will I explain this, because there's no term, there's no phrase like the one in the source language. And you may go back to the provider and say, can you rephrase this in a way because, and then we explain, in this language, this concept doesn't exist, or in whatever it is we need to explain. Identify assumptions that create barriers to understanding. We always have to confirm them. That's the most important thing. Let's go on to the other tasks that we do. Ethical behavior. It's part of what we do. Understanding the complexities of interpreting. We've talked about, overcoming the barriers. We've talked about our responsibilities and not reneging on them, but really taking full charge of our role and our responsibility, because the accuracy of the interpretation is only our responsibility, nobody else's. So if there's any issue taking place that is affecting that, we need to address it. The need for others to trust us is imperative. That's why the transparency is important. The completeness, interpreting everything that is stated, maintaining equal distance from both parties, all those things are very important. The need for professional distance, I don't think I can state it enough. What happens, not so much in remote interpreting, but it could too if you're interpreting for the same people all the time. But mostly it happens with staff interpreters who get to know the providers very well and get to know the patients very well. Obviously, the professional distance takes on a new form, but it needs to remain a professional relationship. So don't cross the line, and you will cross the line if you start asking personal questions. Let's say you're in the waiting room and the patient is there, and all of a sudden you're sharing that you have 5 kids and how many kids do you have. The minute you go there, you're going into a personal relationship. And as much as it's nice and to chit chat, we just need to be careful that the relationship doesn't become closer with one party to the other. So sometimes that's really the best way to guard ourselves for any inappropriate expectations or requests. So let's move on to the next slide here. And actually, we end here with ethical behavior. I didn't realize it, but we will address other issues at another unit. And I thank you very much for listening.